Welcome everybody to another AABA webinar. I'm just going to tell you how to ask questions during this webinar, and then we'll turn it over to Ben and the rest of the panel. So if you are, as you are listening, please type in any questions that you have right into the Q&A box. You'll have a Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom webinar window, and you can type them in there, and Ben will be able to see them. He's going to moderate those questions, and we'll get to them over the course of the webinar. And actually with that, I'm gonna click off of my video and just really enjoy and maybe even ask a few questions myself. So Ben, it's over to you.
We want to thank everyone for taking time out on a Friday afternoon, especially before at least holidays in the United States, to join us for the second part of the panel from the plenary session that we had in Denver in March. So I'm Ben Auerbach. I am one of the co-chairs of the AABA task force on the ethical study of human remains. I will introduce everyone else on the panel in just a second. I just want to remind folks, if you've just joined, that we'll be taking questions through the Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom. And if you can type your answers in, I will be moderating those. So everyone knows what we're going to be doing. We're going to have a very brief overview just to kind of remind people of what the task force has been doing, and also for our task force members and panelists to give a very brief overview of some of the main points that they wanted to raise from the comments that they made back in March. The primary purpose of today, though, is to give everyone an opportunity to ask questions and give us feedback, because the task force only works if we're hearing from you. And I want to offer an apology for the fact that we ran out of time, and it was completely unintentional in March, but that did happen. And so I apologize that we didn't have time during that session to actually take your feedback in Q&A, but we are here to do that today, and also after today. This is not the only opportunity for you all to be giving us feedback on the task force. So without further ado, let me introduce our participants for today. So my co-chair, and as I say, my partner in crime, Dr. Fatima Jackson, who will be speaking in just a minute to kind of give you back an overview of what the survey was of the members of the African American community that we performed in the spring. And then I will be providing a quick overview of what the AABA survey told us. The report on that has been sent to the AABA leadership. They will be posting it to the website soon. And so there should be an announcement coming out about our preliminary report on those survey results. But we'll tell you kind of what the big picture was that came out of those surveys today. In addition, we will also be kind of getting ourselves set up for next phases, and we'll talk about what those are briefly as well. Okay, our other panelists are going to be Dr. Carter Clinton, who is joining us from Penn State, correct? Yes. Carter will be talking about his experiences with partnered research, and also the history of kind of what we do as a discipline. Following him will be Dr. Joseph Jones, who's joining us from College of William and Mary. And Joseph will be also talking about partnered research and his experiences in terms of working with members of communities. Following Dr. Jones, Dr. Jennifer Caldwell will be joining us. Dr. Caldwell is now faculty at, oh my goodness, I just lost the institution. Jennifer, what institution are you at again? Sorry, or Fatima?
I'm at Pennington Biomedical at Louisiana State University.
Thank you. I had an acronym and it was the wrong acronym. So Jennifer is joining us from Louisiana State University. And Dr. Caldwell will be talking also as well about her experiences in community and partnered research, especially within kind of more biomedical and applied anthropology. And then finally, we'll have Dr. Carmen Mosley giving us a very quick overview of her experiences, especially through the Museum of Us, previously known as the Museum of Man in San Diego, especially when it comes to working with communities and partnered research. So Without further ado, I'm going to quickly turn over to Dr. Jackson to present a quick summary of kind of what the task force has been doing and also the findings of our survey of the members of the African American community.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. I am co-chair with Ben, as he said, partner in crime. And I have been working on the African American Survey. And what our goal is to merge the survey from the American Association of Biological Anthropologists with a survey, a representative survey of African Americans across the country, so that we have a very good handle on what the community's desires are, their goals, their expectations. And in the process, we will also be educating them. We received a clearance for the African American work from Howard University, and we've been in consultation with sociologists and psychologists to make sure that we're not only hitting the right questions, but that we're interpreting the answers in a way that really speaks to the intention of the answers. We kept this initial survey very short, 5 questions. First, I'll just go through the questions very briefly. Are you aware that appropriate African American remains are in the possession of U.S. university laboratories and museums? Then we ask if they had, how should these remains be handled? We ask them what guidelines should be put in place for these samples. Who should be consulted to set up these guidelines? And how should these guidelines be enforced? And for most of the people that we interviewed, this was the first time that they had really heard about remains being African-American skeletal and dental remains being in the possession of university labs. But once they became acclimated to the questions, they gave us an earful. So we will be taking this information, using it to structure a workshop. That workshop will hit on the areas that people don't have enough information on, or they've requested greater input into. And then we will be combining the data from the African American community with data from the professional organization, so as to come up with a set of recommendations. We're not in the business of making policy, but our mantra is to best advise the AABA, and to do that with a high level of community consciousness and engagement. So I think that that's about it. That's where we're at right now. And this is a great opportunity to get more feedback from all of the participants. We look forward to your comments, suggestions, etc. Ben?
Thank you, Fatima. So to reiterate, the AABA survey, which I believe many people here probably participated in, took place in the early spring. So it took place between February and March. We were conducting both the survey, our kind of pilot focus group survey of members of the African American community, at the same time that we were also surveying members of the AABA. And so I will say that among the respondents, so we had some interesting parity. We had 538 people respond in the African American focus groups, and we had 587 people complete the AABA survey. So we have, I feel like, decent samples for at least the AABA survey of the membership to give us an idea, barometer of what the association members think, what you all think. And so the report that we have submitted is much more detailed. And so you will see all the numbers in that report once it is posted. But I will say that the big picture is that out of those 587 individuals, and I will say that the majority of people who participated in the survey were either faculty or graduate students, and that the grand majority of people who participated in the survey are involved in some form of research that concerns human remains or biological samples. So we are not representing the entirety of the AABA community, but we are representing what I would say the self-interested members of the AABA community, those of us who are going to be potentially most impacted by the kinds of policies or decisions that may be made by AABA leadership and other organizations when we are starting to come up with ways to address the concerns that got us to form this task force in the first place. So the short version, if I may, on the survey is just that when we ask questions about attitudes and what people think about partnered research, the grand majority of individuals, something close to 90% of the respondents, were very supportive of the idea of partnered or community partnered research. And I just bring that up because the big picture that we also pulled from the African American focus groups is that those individuals too who participated in that largely were also interested in some form of community partnered research. They didn't say they didn't want to have anything to do with biological anthropologists. And I think that that is an important piece of information. We didn't know this a year ago. And we do know now that the AABA membership, as well, at least based on our survey results, and our pilot group of African American focus group participants, at least said something along the lines of, we would like to do some sort of community partners research, which then gives us as a task force information about where to go next. And so quickly, where we are headed as a task force is that we are planning a workshop that will take place in May. The workshop will involve leaders from the African American community and some members of the AABA community to enter into a dialogue so that we can, as Dr. Jackson was just implying or talking about, is that we will be also involved with trying to kind of educate each other and also to talk about mutual points of interest and to try to figure out maybe a roadmap for how we do community partnered research and how that moves forward. So that is where we're headed next as a task force. And that will be the last major thing we do as a task force before we file our final report. So that is where this task force is headed. At that point, we'll be handing our information to the AABA leadership, and we'll be asking them to weigh in on policy and on ideas about how we actually operationalize the information that we provide them. So that was the big picture of our surveys. And so the final report, there was a question that was asked, when is the final report going to be available? The final report will probably be filed next fall after we've completed the workshop and we've completed a secondary survey of about 4,000 individuals who will be from the African American community to try to get a barometer of interest from the African American community about how to do partnered research as well. Okay. So we're trying to go fairly quickly here just so that we give as much time as possible for Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Dr. Clinton to give a summary of what he wanted to bring to everyone's attention. And then we'll go to Dr. Jones, then Dr. Caldwell, and then finally Dr. Mosley. So Dr. Clinton.
Thank you. I'm just gonna throw up this one slide. So, okay, participants can see my screen. So I feel as though I said a lot in the spring. And I will probably expand upon that as we talk about partnered research and relationships with local communities and descendant communities. But I really wanted to use this 2 minutes to pull from a report that was written in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology almost 100 years ago because of its relevance to why we're here today. And I'll jump right in. So it begins at the meeting of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, held at the University of Virginia, April 17th to 19th, 1929. The following mandate was given to the newly created committees on anthropoid and human material. It was further proposed and agreed upon that committees be appointed to collect information as to all anthropoid and human material in this country available for comparative anatomical and anthropological studies, and to undertake proper steps toward conservation of such material in the future. The committee, as you can see here, included some anthropologists who made significant impacts to the field. Okay, and here is a page from the report on human remains, specifically for people identified as Black and the institutions in which they were held. So it continues. Only a few institutions could furnish fairly definite and complete records, and even these records were being modified by new and sometimes important ascensions. Repeated appeals and much correspondence were necessary to bring the data into their present condition. As it is, the records give a fair idea of the anthropological collections of this country and Canada at about the beginning of this year or that year. But every 5 or 10 years, these data should be revised and supplemented for the principal collections because they're at least steadily growing and may even change their general character or the content of those collections. So while this report was created for different reasons, other than those that have brought us here today, we have to wonder the same types of questions. Do we have a complete catalog of human remains held in institutions, organizations, and museums? Perhaps this is a good starting point that may allow us to understand and answer questions, maybe the mode by which they were obtained, whether they're actively used, and their conditions. And with these data, we may be able to better maintain the collections for ethical study, to perform community partnered research, or to better do so, and or for means of repatriation. So as kind of a segue for the other points that the other panelists are going to bring up, right? Are we asking the same 100-year-old questions? Thank you.
All right.
Dr. Jones.
Okay. All right. So good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'd like to thank Drs. Auerbach and Jackson again for inviting me to participate on this panel. In order to keep myself concise and to kind of expedite this, I think I've narrowed down to about 2 or 3 kind of what I think are kind of key questions that I'm hoping that that if we consider them, that we'll be able to kind of help us to flesh out what are the main issues and to be dealt with both internally within the association, then also as a bridge, as bridging issues as we consider with the work of the committee going forward. Just by way of background, my research, I do skeletal biology, and I'm currently involved with 2 projects that are that involve skeletal research. They're both community engaged. The first is the East Marshall Street Well Project, based out of Richmond, Virginia Commonwealth University. These are the remains of at least 50 individuals who were used for dissection, medical training, surgical training, and were disposed of in a well on the campus of what became currently is VCU Health. Many of us know it as Medical College of Virginia. It's known for many years. And I'm serving there as a member both on the research team, but then also as a member of the what's known as the Family Representative Council. And so these are community representatives because I grew up in Richmond. I was invited to participate on that group as well. And so I've gotten some pretty interesting insights from kind of wearing both hats and sitting on both sides of the table over the past 5 or 6 years here. Secondly, the project that is closer to my institutional home here in Williamsburg is that of the First Baptist Church. It's one of the earliest churches in the nation here, and we are currently looking at 3 individuals who are serving as something of a pilot, and we are will be sharing out and reporting back to the community to see what their wishes are in terms of possibly doing a further excavation there. My understanding is that they're up to at least 45 burials there, not all of which will yield skeletal remains, possibly, or high quality remains. But those are 2 projects that I'm working on. And over the last several years, the questions that have come to mind for me most as we've kind of dealt with issues or tried to ward off issues during this research is trying to figure out where our goals as the researchers align best with those of community members, figuring out where they where those interests diverge. And when I say our goals, I'm talking about our goals with respect to skeletal research, of course, but then also more broadly to include memorialization or remembrance activities, and of course in many instances, in most instances, reburial or reinterment of the skeletal remains ultimately as well. And then where do those interests diverge, and why? I think is the big question, right? Where do these interests, where do they align? So for example, with the Well Project, we are interested in creating opportunities for more STEM pipelining of minority, especially African-American researchers, to use this project, their interest in the project, to then come into the lab to see the type of work that's done, with the hope that they would then think of anthropology or genetics as possible career futures. So there's alignment there with broader community members, but there are also issues of tension in some instances. And I want to know, I've been trying to figure out, what those are, and which of those tensions are healthy, which of those tensions are useful for keeping me as a researcher and for keeping the institutions honest with respect to the community empowerment portion of the engagement, which is so important. And then secondly, the other big question, I know my time is drawing up, I said I would be concise, is that, understanding, what constitutes a proper and effective informed consent process. What does informed consent look like in such a way that it's not merely, are engaging long enough to get the answers that we want in terms of access to remains and so forth, but engaging in a sustained way so that people, even including feedback loops, so that people can always have a mechanism for weighing in on the process, even as it unfolds, because these are dynamic processes and they change from project to project, is what we're seeing. And what people want today may not be what they want tomorrow. And so how do we facilitate and accommodate, those changes through informed consent and sustained engagement? So I'll stop there and hopefully provide some fodder for questions.
So thank you both, Drs. Clinton and Jones. Dr. Caldwell?
All right, let me show you all a few slides so that I can stay on target as well. Okay, so as my name is Dr. Jennifer Caldwell, I am a new faculty at Pennington Biomedical, and as a part of my new role, I get to design my laboratory, and so I'm fitting my research into public health genomics. And so like the previous 2 speakers spoke about the dead, I actually work with the living. And so my research focuses on community engagement. How can I use anthropology and public health skills to get people involved in research? And so one of the main things that we want to think about is not only is it important for you to know your ancestry, but what are you doing now in your environment and in your daily habits that contribute to disease? And so a broader question that I'm asking is, what what is your exposure like? What is your cultural exposure? What is your environmental exposure? Do you live close to toxins? My first case study for my research was the Gullah Geechee from the South Carolina Sea Islands. And now I'm looking at Louisiana populations, seeing the differences between our diverse cultures there, how they mix. And I want to employ these same skill sets to other populations. So I want to know about your daily habits, your culture, what things do you believe about yourself, and how does that carry on to your health outcomes? And so what you will see in my connection to this work is fighting for equity in spaces where equity does not exist, and thinking about what things make your lifestyle equitable, right? So do we have the same amount of, so sorry, y'all, my voice is out. Do we have the same amount of social economic resources in certain communities? How does that contribute to disease? Why or why not do you choose certain people groups to be a part of studies? And what biases do we see that might be unconscious in certain research because of not fitting into the mold of a clinical diagnosis, right? Why do you pick certain groups to be a part of research in terms of their belief system, or how can we be more engaging with them so that they will participate? So I work with the populations to facilitate the ease of them understanding the research, but also making sure that scientists are able to see beyond some of their unconscious bias in their research design.
Thank you, Dr. Caldwell. Okay, so Dr. Mosley.
Hi, thank you so much to Ben and Fatima for having us again, and I'm glad that we're finally convening to have this webinar. My name is Carmen Mosley. I am the NAGPRA Repatriation Manager at the Museum of Us in Balboa Park, San Diego, formerly the Museum of Man. And I mostly work with Indigenous communities and tribal representatives to return their belongings and their ancestors under NAGPRA. Also return cultural items that maybe don't fall under NAGPRA as well. And so I think the only thing that I would really like to add, just maybe from my experience, working mostly with Native American Indigenous communities and from a museum sort of standpoint, is that museums and institutions who are the places where a lot of these human remains are housed and are cared for. It is sort of reliant on them, I believe, now that they already have those materials, those items, to carry out and change perhaps their mission and their values, and to move forward with either consented stewardship or community partnered research in a way that is driven by their institutional values and policies. And for the Museum of Us, we have, decolonizing initiatives and a colonial pathways policy that I'm happy to answer questions about, and moving forward in that way. And so I'm just actually going to leave it there, and I'll yield the rest of my time back to the larger membership so that we can start to answer questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mosley. Thank you all again for your time and participation. So we are finally engaging in what we did not get to do in March. And so this is an opportunity for us to answer questions that you all that are here watching us will be able to ask questions about what the task force is doing, questions to our 4 panelists about their ideas concerning community-based research, community-partnered research, and anything that you might want to share with us. There are already a handful of questions that are in the Q&A box. We do ask, for those of you who have joined us since we got started, that if you please type your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. You'll see on your Zoom, there's a little Q&A box. So if you click on that, you can type in questions, and I will present these questions to the panelists. We also, of course, have the questions that have been asked by all the panelists that we can also be addressing. So the floor is opened. I will say so of these three first questions, Dr. Jackson, I believe these might be questions that you would be best equipped to answer because they're concerning the African-American focus groups. So the first one was asking why we chose to use the term laboratory as opposed to, as compared to museum. So why do we use those two terms separately? Oh, you're muted.
The sense I got was that, no, we use both terms. They were not separated, but the laboratory is a different space than a museum. And even for non-professionals, the laboratory is a different space than a museum. And the expectations in terms of the use of materials is different for those, but both were used in our survey. So it wasn't a dichotomy at all. It was, we asked the community members about laboratory access to African-American skeletal and dental materials, as well as museum access to African-American skeletal and dental materials. And we also went beyond just those skeletal and dental materials and asked about DNA. We asked about tissue. We asked, so because the whole issue of ownership doesn't stop with skeletal material. That's just the beginning of the past appropriation of African-American materials. So for the second question, it says, by which process were the community participants chosen that were included in the community survey? And so as Ben mentioned, we did focus groups. And so as you're familiar, focus groups are small numbers of individuals. We did not do a probability survey because this was a preliminary survey just to get an idea of what kinds of ideas were out there, just to get a sense of what ideas were out there, what perspectives did people have, were they even willing to consider joining with biological anthropologists to evaluate the status of these African-American skeletal, dental, and other materials. So it was very preliminary. It was an opportunistic sample, which means that we got whomever we could get, and we tried to make sure that we had a broad cross-section in terms of occupation, age, education in our sample. And we sampled 600 people, but 500 of the surveys were actually complete. And we got some pretty good ideas about the range of perspectives in the African-American community, not only on the East Coast, but also down South and also on the West Coast.
If I may, I'm happy to kind of take this next question of what can we expect to see in the final report? Honestly, I don't know yet. We don't know yet because we're still getting information, but I can tell you that the preliminary report that we just filed gives survey results, and it gives information about what, with some kind of attempt to synthesize what we got out of those survey results. I think that there is anxiety among members of the AABA because I've talked to plenty of you all out there over the course of the last few months that, you know, are we going to be deciding on policy? Are we going to be putting some sort of plan in place? And to make sure we're clear, this task force was never given the charge to create policy. And both Fatima and I have reminded the leadership that we are not here to create policy. We're here to find information. We're here to find ways of creating a roadmap for what we think might be in the mutual interest of communities of origin and of the AABA membership, which is it's a narrow road, but there is a road. So we are trying to figure out at least what that road looks like, and to give enough information so that the AABA leadership can make an informed decision, and you as the membership, right, can make an informed decision about what we are going to do as an association to address the concerns that we've had, that we've raised over the last many years. And so I think that is really what we're intending to do. So the final report will probably be more informational than it will be prescriptive, because that has never been the intention of what this task force is. So, and you can, you know, if there's further concern about that, please let us know what your specific concerns are so we can take those into account. The next question is about, yes, there are many Asian remains that are in collections, and as Dr. Clinton showed us in that paper from Montague Cobb 100 years ago, there were, you know, this has been a concern for our association for a long time. The question is whether we will be engaging with the Asian American community. So ultimately, the task force is going to just stick to working with the African American community, not because we're trying to exclude any other community, not that we think that any other communities are more or less important. It's because there are so many communities of origin that we need to work with as an association that we decided early on as a task force that it would be very unwieldy for us to try to come up with a roadmap by looking at multiple communities. We know that the plans that we have to develop ultimately have to be very flexible, and that they're going to be dependent on each community. There's going to be, you know, there are what, 44 million plus African Americans in the United States. That is not one community, that is communities. And for us to try to say that there's one way for us to engage with any community, that we have to have flexibility. So we're just trying to get enough information by interacting with one, albeit very large and heterogeneous in the sense of many communities, like a community of communities, that we're, as a task force, just using that to kind of get some traction to try to figure out how to give information that's meaningful to the AABA. Otherwise, this task force would be working for, well, I would be dead, and I'm younger than Dr. Jackson. No offense, Dr. Jackson. But you know, but I mean, like we would not be finished as a task force if we try to do every community. So we're just focusing on African Americans. Again, that's not because we don't think the other communities are equally worthy of consideration, but that was how we made a decision early on as a task force to go about our work. So that's a long answer to a short question, but I just want to make sure that was clear.
Right.
I might just, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Please, Carmen.
No, just to say that quickly, that no community is a template for another community. We feel that the African American community has unique perspectives that need to be evaluated separately from that which has gone on before. So we have some information on Native American communities, for example, but their correspondence to African American communities just is not there. It's a different history. So each community has to be taken as its own control, you know? Anyway, Carmen, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, just to perhaps add a little bit to Ben, to say that, to acknowledge perhaps, right, that there are lots of communities whose ancestors and are in many museum collections around the world, and that it will take some time to do this. And then also, Fatima, to talk to what you said, that there isn't a template that's going to fit every single community. It looks very different, even among Indigenous and Native American communities in various parts of the country, depending on what their relationships and interactions have been like with researchers and scientists and of that nature. But also to say that hopefully there may be some principles or common threads that we can take. And the fact that is engagement with those communities for a lot of these collections, where especially medical or paleopathology collections where we really don't know anything. We have really no provenience except geography, but trying to identify, ethnic communities from that is very difficult. So just kind of how to start having these conversations with current communities and members of communities, so that we can sort of start to kind of find the ways that we can connect with the existing descendant communities to kind of start making progress towards that. So I think that this work that the task force is doing, that Ben and Fatima is doing, can help us get some of those principles in line, so that we can start to apply this and have these with all of the other communities that we need to do this work for.
So that actually dovetails well into the next question that was asked. How conflicting have the responses been, since we're talking about communities, right? So even within a community, right? How conflicting have the responses been with regard to what to do with human remains? Where are there conflicts? How have you all considered presenting or responding to those differences? So I can say, at least as far as the AABA survey is concerned, that there are differences of opinion among the membership of the AABA, and we kind of asked it based on, for those of you who took the survey, there was a Likert scale. So what you thought was very important and what you thought was not very important. So for example, repatriating remains actually was considered to be far less important than engaging with communities of origin and research. And so the way we're right now dealing with that information is just for ourselves internally report the information. So we're just recording where there are points of conflict, because if we can kind of quantify where there are points of conflict, that helps us try to, especially Joseph, you're better to speak about this than me, because you brought this up, that there's this point of like why it's so important for us to be thinking about points of contention between communities and to learn from that. So do you maybe have anything you want to add?
Sure. What I think what we see is that we're actually doing dual work here when we're doing this form of engagement. I think we have to think about what are our intentions, what are our goals when we say that we're engaging? What do we mean by engaging? Right? We can engage for a variety of purposes. In some of my classes, I like to use Low and Mary's 2010. I think it was a current anthropology piece in which they kind of give us a little typology of forms of engagement. So we can engage for public education and outreach, which is kind of typical of like public archaeology, right? You might be simply collaborating to share resources that the institution has that community members may not have or have access to. And then there's, advocacy, and even on the other end of the spectrum, activism, activist scholarship, of which we often think of the African Burial Ground in New York as being a kind of a premier example of that. And so given, so I think first, kind of figuring out where you're trying to align yourself, kind of what your commitments are is important. And then you have a clear sense, I think, of, where the conflicts are and where you fall in relation to those. And so, so I started by saying that, we're doing dual research, often maybe lost in some of these questions, is that community members are bringing not only their concerns about the skeletal remains, to the table, but often also their feelings and their histories with these institutions. And so, and this can, be in the case of the, a Will project, we had a broad community meetings that then resulted in the formation of this smaller group with the nomination, self-nomination of individuals who were selected for the Family Representative Council to be a representative, a small representative group, to actually make decisions on the behalf of the broader community. And within our FRC, are former students of VCU. These are typically African-American women, middle-aged and older women, typically comprise these groups. That's the case here, and some of them have histories, with the institution, and we're respectful of that, and so I think, so the conflicts can come from a variety of sources. It can be sometimes we need to unknot, sometimes untangle, kind of what's going on at the institutional level, and then what are people's actual considerations, sensitivities around actual skeletal research itself, how much of that is. So I think that's an important distinction to make so that, the research can be lost in that, no matter how valuable or how people might feel otherwise, if you don't kind of figure that out, that is a potential hurdle, a barrier to this research. That said, the communities, as you were saying, there have been are diverse, and we heard a variety of voices, both in the larger groups and then also within the FRC itself, as to whether or not skeletal research should take place. Ultimately, we looked at the notes from the broader community whom we were supposed to be representing, and realized that most people wanted skeletal research to be done to include genetic analyses. And so realized that we were representative of that larger group. We went forth, making that recommendation. That was the recommendation that was put forth. But there were a variety of, voices there. And the way that we chose to, to deal with that was simply to go with the right of the majority, to govern within the FRC. We did not actually cast, votes, but where we saw that there was a majority, then we would proceed accordingly. But it really goes, I think, this bigger question of the engagement process. As Dr. Blakey likes to say here, Michael Blakey likes to say here, some of the research that we do, the process is the product in a lot of ways, right? And so making sure that people are engaged early on and are and remain engaged throughout that process. One of the lessons learned and where some conflicts, sometimes arose is when the role of the FRC kind of subsided a bit after we made our recommendations report. We went on, our process involved moving on to an implementation phase, and so we had FRC representation on the implementation groups, but the FRC itself was not still meeting as regularly and not consulted kind of as its own entity autonomously as it had been. And there lied some problems that we were able to correct. Yes, so that's our solution to dealing with any conflicts that might arise is to make sure that that voice, that autonomous community voice, is kind of maintained, supported by the institution, and also that we're really clear as to where the final decision-making power is, because ultimately, for us, this is about power and community empowerment. And so we're clear that the community members, that the onus is on us to show the value of the work, to show the value of the research. And we have seen that in both projects, African Americans have wanted to see the research done. They wanted to partner specifically, with a particular, with our laboratory, what have you, to do this work. But we don't assume, that to be the case. And we realize that we have to continuously keep them informed, up to date, and that ultimately, we kind of look to them for guidance as to, how, the scope, of the research. We provide the technical expertise, of course, and we have professional standards that we share that we have to meet with, but everyone's clear, that, kind of at every step, at every phase as to what the goals are, where the decision-making, power lies, and that has helped us to deal with, any the few conflicts that have come up so far. Really, with the First Baptist Church, not substantial conflicts have come because of this process.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything they want to add?
I did want to add, I think Dr. Jones made several excellent points, and he also brought up the New York African Burial Ground Project, where I've kind of continued the research, after Michael Blakey coming into the graduate program. But the points that I wanted to speak to were that you mentioned that the community are the stakeholders, and that doesn't just mean that they have the ability to say how they feel or make demands or access to certain information, but it also means that they're stakeholders in making decisions and designing the research. So in working with the New York African Burial Ground and moving forward with other burial grounds, like in Shelby, North Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, I will only address research now if not in the traditional way of designing research questions, but starting with a town hall. So what does the community want to know? And can we achieve those goals or those desires or those objectives with the technology that we have? And that's where the real power lies with the descendant community or the local community.
Okay. I think that actually does lead to our next question pretty well. The next question was, is there a role for creating some public programming, meaning free and open to the public, not just practitioners, about ethical practice and research in the field at future AABA meetings or as virtual events? So, I mean, none of us here have power over, we're not vice presidents that are in charge of determining the programming for meetings, but we as task force members can certainly, if that is something that we desire to do as a community, that is absolutely something that we can, as a task force, push for as part of this process, right? If community engagement is ultimately going to be, again, we don't have a final report yet, so we don't know exactly what we're advocating in terms of that final report. But one of the things that we'll almost certainly be advocating for will be a community partnered approach, because that has emerged out of both surveys that we've already conducted. That is going to be something that there's mutual interest in between the AABA community and at least the pilot African-American survey. And of course, we're going to be doing a much larger survey later this upcoming year to give us even more of an idea. But I would say that, we already are planning on doing community engagement in the form of the workshop that we have planned for May, because we will be trying to bring in various leaders out from the African-American community and members of the AABA together in conversation about what our mutual interests are and what we see that narrow road, but the road that we can see as a roadmap for engaging in mutually beneficial research, if that is what is desired. So, I think that it's a little murky. It may seem a little murky from us right now, but that's because we are still gathering information. And I know that I think we actually have this in our report, our preliminary report. At the end, we basically state, we know that there's urgency, and we are definitely aware. If I may speak on behalf of the broader membership of the task force, we are broadly aware of the fact that there's urgency for coming up with solutions, but we also want to be deliberate in how we get to giving information so that the AABA can make informed decisions. So we're trying to be purposeful in gathering information, even though we know there is urgency in doing so. So I came a long way away, but yes, I think if there's interest or willpower for doing community engaged or open kind of free public opportunities for people to talk about ethics and their concerns, that should be probably something that we could bake into AABA future meetings. Yes. So Jennifer, I think you have a question or comment.
So I would also like to add that it would be really beneficial to establish a community-based stakeholder or community advisory board at your university or within the populations that you're working with, so that they can be involved in every step of the research, and they will help you learn the barriers in that particular community. That's something that I use, is something that we use at Pennington as well. And it would be really helpful to get your feedback from your university on what you all are doing, what's working, and come back to the task force. And that way we can talk about how to approach communities about consent, how to approach communities about autonomy, what their rights actually are in the research design. And it would just help us to kind of gauge more of an understanding of the cultural context of the communities you serve. What are the nuances and the differences, so that we can be more on point when we give you all recommendations. And it would also serve you to have kind of a DEI board to establish really good practices in your research design. And so that's another thing that I kind of lead over one of the grants at Pennington is how can we do academic sensitivity training for researchers when they approach communities in their research design and maintaining relationships with stakeholders. And by stakeholders, I mean people that are part of that community advisory board. We have monthly meetings with them to kind of gauge what needs to be done, what we are currently doing, how they can be, how they can serve us, how we can serve them. It's just keeping those lines of bi-directional relationship open and flowing consistently from start to finish will really help to advance the science forward, because we need you. You know, you are all our people. So.
Yes.
And if I may add, actually, so a couple of things. So I think Jennifer, you bring up something really important there, which is that, you know, we, as I was just kind of implying, we're going to be deliberate and maybe not speedy necessarily as a task force, but that's no reason to wait for the task force to maybe help you figure out solutions for your particular research questions or ways to engage in the communities with whom you are, you're going to be engaging your research. So in that respect, I mean, you don't have to necessarily wait. And also alongside those terms, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The nice thing is that one of the pieces that, and it's a very small piece that came out of the AABA survey that I think is just worth pointing out, is that among the respondents, there were 37 individuals who identified themselves as being kind of long-term community partnered researchers who answered questions in our AABA survey. And I know that's not everyone. I know there's more than 37 of us that have engaged in community-based research or in community partnered research. And so I think that, if you have questions or you want to think about ways to engage in community research, I mean, you have 4 people on this, five people. I'm the only one, I'm the odd person out. I'm the only person, I mean, I mostly am now working with primates, which that's another issue. But like most everyone here has worked in community partnered research in some form or another. So you have 5 people on this panel you can reach out to, and there are plenty of other members within the AABA that you can also reach out to ask about how they have done their research. How have they engaged with communities? So, you don't have to feel like this is some insurmountable kind of approach to doing research, because there are plenty of people who can would be happy, I imagine. I'm not volunteering anyone here, but I imagine amongst the community, people who would be very happy to share their experiences and their knowledge so that you can, start to do the community partnered research if you are so interested in pursuing that before, the AABA task force, which, it's, I think early on in this process, I basically said, the AABA is a very large ship, and it's an old creaky ship to a certain degree, not to say that we're old and creaky, but, we've been around as an association for almost 100 years. And, when you think about, when associations have that much inertia, it takes a long time to change the steerage of the ship, right? To maybe change the directions in which we do our work. And so it's a slow process, but that doesn't mean you have to wait for that to happen if that's something you want to engage in. So sorry, that's a long follow-up. I just thought I'd point that out before we got to our next question. Does anyone have anything else they wanted to add? Okay, so our next question was, are you only looking at remains that are already acquired and being stored in institutes, or are you also considering new finds? Fatima.
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. Yes, we are considering new finds because the technology is constantly improving. So now we have DNA collections, we have ancient DNA collections, we have RNA collections, we have tissue banks, we have cell lines. And you remember the big hullabaloo about the HeLa cell lines and so forth. So there, we have an almost unending stream of biological samples that need to be considered in this question of the reinternment of remains. So it's not simply skeletal and dental materials, but these other soft materials as well, and molecular materials. And in fact, what we have found is that the community is very interested in understanding the nature of those materials. So that's part of our focus group. Part of what it's revealing is the increased interest in DNA and DNA applications and connecting skeletal biology to DNA results and ancestry and so forth. I think Dr. Jones spoke of this. So the answer is yes.
So the next question that's been raised, so I'll read it in its entirety. What advice could you provide for how a university should best proceed in the short term when very public and vocal negative concerns are raised by members of the public and likely descendants regarding care and or treatment of human remains, not Native American, these are historic Euro-American cemetery populations, that the university is currently caring for and or conducting research on? A thumbnail sketch of long-term approach would also be helpful. Does anyone have a response to that question?
I feel like we'll probably all be able to, depending on the different communities that we've worked with, can all probably chime in. My first initial response would be to listen to what they have to say. What are their concerns? What are their requests? And how can you incorporate them into perhaps short-term, immediate priorities, which might be some cultural care requests, like how the remains that are cared for, how they are down to how they're stored, right? To long-term concerns, and maybe similar to what Carter had mentioned is maybe these members, community members, have an interest in learning about these remains or their ancestors if they are lineal descendants, learning about who they are, learning about what kind of health or condition they might have been in when they passed. So my initial response would be to listen, invite them in, and see what they have to say.
Yes, so can I say I would probably take it perhaps Carmen, one step further, and that is to say that, I think within the question, we can see, really that there are some serious issues that probably should be addressed prior to the research. And what we've found is that, with the research, there have been instances in which we've actually asked institutions to simply slow down, not to say that, research will not happen, but one of the ways that power is taken away from communities is by, this insistence that, we have our deadlines and we have to move quickly. And so as I look at this question, what jumps out to me is the fact that the research appears to be ongoing already. And yet there are people raising, apparently, concerns, issues about, that research and the overall disposition or handling of the remains. And so I would, my counsel would be to reach out to those researchers, to ask them to halt or to pause until these issues can be addressed, because otherwise the community will not have trust. As I kind of alluded to earlier, the institutional distrust is one of the main barriers before you can even get to this question of what people want to do with the skeletal remains, there's this, broader issue of institutional distrust, institutional humility that needs to be shown. And so that would be my, my initial take, certainly in the short term. And then in the long term, you have to have a process. As we said, as I forget if it was, I think it was Carter who mentioned, that community hall. That's how we begin our process broadly, and then settling in on those descendants, community members who would, be representative for the broader community, and then giving them decision-making power. right? If you go through those steps, we found that people, as Dr. Jackson and Dr. Albrecht have said, in most cases, people are certainly interested in collaborating and want to, conduct research, but it is totally reasonable, for them to want to do so through a process which they have some say in the care of their ancestral remains. All right. And so it sounds as though, and we don't have all the details here, but it sounds as though, that process probably has not been followed through, or perhaps has not been followed through, carefully enough, such that these issues either would not come up or could be addressed in some way. So there's some risk there. This is power sharing. This is just not us kind of saying this is how we're going to do it. But through the process, as we've seen at least, folks they're interested. They want to know. They just want to know first that you care, about the living, and then, they want to see that played out and how you respect those ancestral remains. And so those would be my in the short term. It sounds to me like these issues should be addressed, and then perhaps pausing the research until they are, and then the long term establishing that community engagement process. And there are models out there, kind of going back to the previous question. As part of the work we're doing for the Jamestown on a separate project, we'll be compiling kind of best practices around community engagement. And so we'll be kind of happy to share that out. It'll be over the course of the upcoming year, that we'll be developing those. But those materials are out there, and so I would look to some of those. And as Dr. Albrecht has said, we're happy to assist here.
And I'll briefly add to that. One of the first points that you made was, going to the researchers, having them halt research until you can figure out until you can identify what those demands are of the descendant community. And I think that even goes beyond the researchers and to the institution or the universities, right? Because sometimes, and I think that what you were getting at, right, is that there's ongoing research. It may not, unbeknownst to, this descendant community. And sometimes people just want acknowledgement, right? And to be heard. And sometimes I think especially in this situation, with the way the foundations of anthropology and medicine as a discipline, right? Sometimes all it takes is for the university to do a look back and acknowledge those past transgressions. And that is the first step in moving forward with, how to conduct research, what to do with these remains, how to engage with the community, and everything that comes after that.
Just to follow up, sometimes it comes across as if universities own the remains. And that's really off-putting to the communities because they feel like a special connection to the remains themselves, and they would like to have a special connection to those remains. So just making sure that they're a part of that process, whether they're writing, up some verbiage on who these people groups are, that would be really helpful to just allow them into the process of research and not feeling like, a university owns people.
It's very important, right? Possession versus ownership, two very different things. That's how it was explained to us out of the Smithsonian through the Dorothy Lippert at the Smithsonian and the Native American Smithsonian there kind of explained to us that, that distinction. That's why we brought the remains back from the Smithsonian to Richmond, because they acknowledged that they were in possession, but did not have, kind of ownership, including to, who possesses or who owns the data that comes out of this. These are other considerations that we'll have to think about. These are things that we're, beginning to wrestle with the Well project.
Yeah, data sharing was something that came up early in the task force and continues to be kind of an undercurrent conversation that we're having about what happens with data and data sharing and the rest of that. And that's another, that's a really, really important set of questions. And unfortunately, I don't know, I'm hoping we have a chance to talk about it as a task force to at least to kind of investigate that somewhat too. But we also are fortunate that, Trudy Turner and Connie Mulligan and others have also been talking about data sharing, within the association. And Fatima and I have had some conversations with them as well to kind of just try to learn from them what they're learning as well. So, I think that there will be further advice hopefully coming from that. And I definitely say that as someone who hosts 2 large repositories of shared data, right? So I think that this is something we definitely need to address. So thank you all. I think that I hope that was a useful, at least gave some useful ideas for the person who asked that question about maybe some ways forward and how to maybe start addressing the concern. So the next question, I'll try to summarize it. The question ultimately is, when we're talking about ethical stewardship, or even forms of repatriation, or just how we engage with human remains, how do we operate when affinities are ambiguous? So what advice do we have for getting started with community engagement when we don't necessarily know who the community is? So they say if lack of documents or records and osteological analyses have reached an inconclusive result, are genetic analyses appropriate? Or does experience indicate that this may actually be inflicting more indignity upon the remains? So this is a Gordian knot. I will say that from my point of view, because this is one of the questions that actually emerged out of our surveys. So one of the big questions is, how do you even know who the community of origin might be? And that is a very hard question to address. So I'm going to sidestep the question myself and hand it to the panelists to see what you all have to say about that, and then maybe we can collectively come up with an answer that at least addresses the question.
So this is one of my favorite parts of designing the research, is figuring out who the population thinks that they are, what the literature says. And sometimes academic research can be far different than history books, far different than a person's perspective. And so I kind of do a combo of asking questions, YouTube, Instagram, academic literature, and just asking people who they think they are. And even good history books, really good detailed anthropology and historical records really help with defining a population. So I kind of do that type of approach. I'm sure there's not only one right answer to who people think that they are. And so after I talk to the people groups and kind of do that analysis, I'm able to kind of come up with, okay, some of this is right, some of this is wrong, and how do we, go forward from there? So that's one of my favorite parts, because it's a lot of details and a lot of storytelling.
Carmen, I might ask you your thoughts, since I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but since you're right in the thick of this at Museum of Us, what your thoughts are.
If it sounds like we're talking, so we have an osteological human remains collection, and you don't have a specific, an unknown affinity. My initial response is going to be not to proceed with any genetic analysis, because that is not likely going to have a pleasant outcome. Now, as NAGPRA law stands, there's a term of culturally unidentifiable, which has historically been used. Well, it's possible that it was used as a way to not return human remains, because institutions were not able to identify, a living descendant community to return those remains. There are now proposed changes to the law, to NAGPRA law and regulations, so that it removes culturally identifiable and integrates an idea of repatriation through geographic origin. And so if you have even any ounce or tidbit of geographic provenance or locational information, I would start there and look at what, if this is in the United States, what Indigenous or Native American communities there are in that region. I mean, even if it's state, or even if it's large regions, Southeast, right? Because you can reach out to those communities and then they can help you. It's similar to kind of the same thing that we've, have been have emphasizing, is that once you have an idea, you can reach out to those communities, those indigenous communities, Native American communities, and they can help you. But hopefully moving forward for these, there are many thousands, hundreds of thousands, I don't know how many, human remains in museums, institutions, universities across the country that are still in collections because they were flagged as being culturally unidentifiable. And so hopefully these proposed changes will make it so that they can be returned home through at least a geographic origin pathway. I don't know if that helps, but
well, I mean that helps for Native American remains, but I don't know if the question was particular to Native American.
I don't know either. So
yeah. So Fatima, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, the history and the background for African Americans is distinct from the Native American condition. So in fact, genetics has been a godsend for African Americans wishing to reconstruct a history that was taken from them. So it's again, you have to always start where the community is. You have to understand the history of the people that you're working with. You have to be attuned to their sensitivities. And again, no one community serves as a template for others. And even within Native American communities, as you know, there's quite a bit of diversification and variability. But certainly for African Americans, the genetic opportunities have begun to overrule 400 years of oppression and white supremacy, that they've allowed African Americans to reconnect with African ancestors and to resolve the non-African admixture that's in African American communities. So again, the solutions depend very much on the history and the priorities of the people under study. That's it.
But I might add though, so to kind of, come back to the question that was asked, if the remains were of unknown affinity, so they're not Native American or Indigenous American, they're not necessarily deemed to be African American. If you're not really sure, I think that it is kind of, this is a question for the task force ultimately. Is it our responsibility as biological anthropologists to try to ascertain the identity, at least the way that we're trying to at least find affiliation to talk to communities? Is it beholden on us to try to figure out who those individuals were? Or do we as an association say that we're comfortable with having remains of unknown provenience, and we just continue to say we just don't know who they belong to, and so they languish in a collection. There's no community that ever gets contacted. I mean, and then there are other questions that get related to that. I can just imagine that are something along the lines of, well, what if there is a community that we know historically existed, but maybe that community is now considered to no longer exist, right? We definitely have, I mean, the population immediately largely comes to mind, and this is not entirely true because there are people who identify themselves as Tasmanian, right? But there was also a concerted effort to basically eliminate the Tasmanian population. So, the question comes down to, it's like, what happens in those circumstances? Now that one has been addressed by the Australian government, but what I'm getting at is that there are particular circumstances that make it maybe difficult for us to talk to those communities. So to just repivot the question just a little bit for you all, do you think it's in your opinion, and this is not the task force saying anything about what we think is policy, but do you think it's our responsibility as anthropologists to try to figure out who we're looking at? If we can't figure it out, is it our responsibility? Is it like an imperative for us to know who the unknown remains belong to?
Yes, if I can chime in, yes, I think we do have that responsibility, and it's And because we know that ancestry and descent are complicated, and it's for that reason that we use our notion of social. We'll also often begin with the notion, at least, of social ancestry, and look at social descent as a basis for constructing, realizing that often these communities these descendant communities that we end up consulting with, we have to construct them. And so, for example, I mentioned that I served on the Family Representative Council for the East Marshall Street Will Project, but I'm not from Richmond. I'm not from Virginia originally. I moved there as a young child when my father went there for school, and we were kind of the only branch of our family that stayed out east. And yet, because of having grown up there and the interest that I showed in the process, in the process. I was invited onto it. And so I think we can look at, this notion of social descent, and there are examples again out there. If we look at the Montpelier, the rubric that they've developed, on which they talk about, kind of the criteria of having people who are, who maybe, if it's a known community, members of the community, in this instance, it wouldn't be a known community, but those who care, those who are, kind of there, and that social descent can serve as the basis, I think, for that representative body, to speak for these remains, or it may be a bridge onto a biological relationships that we can establish, through DNA or through genetics research. So, for example, we will do analysis of the remains from the will to see if we can connect them to living peoples. And if that is the case, then we've got a whole other set of questions, right, that we have to address in terms of the stewardship, proper stewardship of those, and the rights that they would have, to their lineal kin. And so, yes, I think we do have that. We do have that responsibility for us. This notion of social, descent has been very helpful, because it does not necessarily mean that one has to show biological kinship, or even have direct geographic origins there, because we know that people move, they've migrated, people have moved around. Population migrations have always been complicated, and as a result, so is ancestry and descent and so forth. And so yeah, for us, that concept has been very, very useful, just to address the constructed nature often of the community, of the descendant communities that we're working with. And if there's enough, we can do the historical research. We can, these people had connections, right? They had families, and so to the best of our abilities, we try to follow those leads.
I wanted to chime in. Well, first wanted to say, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's worth exploring to tease out what that question even means. So also to Dr. Jones, your point, also to Dr. Auerbach, your point, right? People move around. And even going back to the question, it could be difficult to identify that descendant community. And are we putting a cap on a timeline for human remains? So if we're going back, 7,000 years, right? Or 40,000 years, right? For not just communities that don't exist, but even for locations, that no longer exist, or borders that have changed and became anew. How do we deal with those remains, right? Like, who does Lucy belong to, right? And, the further you go back, right, everybody has that argument, right? Put it to that bottleneck, like 7,000 years ago, everybody has that argument that I am also related to that fossil, to that, ancestor, right? So I think it is worth, again, I don't have the answer, but clearly from what I'm hearing, there's a difference, right, between human remains that were collected and used and studied, or initially studied hundreds of years ago, 200 years ago, or decades ago, as opposed to thousands of years ago. And that importance and how we see ourselves, that importance around how related we connect ourselves with those communities. So I think that I don't know, again, I don't have the answer, but I think that is worth a conversation. You can't just say we need to repatriate these individuals, but because these individuals are several thousands of years old, we can just leave them on display?
So, I mean, I think that part of, Carmen, what you were getting at in your response too, and this speaks to what you're talking about, Carter, is that, you know, with NAGPRA, we have federal guidelines, but those are particular to, you know, what are federally designated groups and federally recognized groups. I think what we're talking about is this kind of broader question of what do we do with human remains as a whole. And I think that one of the take homes that we're getting, at least from the feedback that we've had from surveys and from members, is also that it's very idiosyncratic, right? It's very particular to the circumstances. And so we have to be mindful of the fact that what applies to one group may not apply to others. And that's one of the special challenges. I think that's one of the reasons why I didn't shy away from you know, wanting to help through the task force myself, is because these are interesting problems. Not to intellectualize what is more than an intellectual problem, right? But these are interesting problems for us collectively to try to solve. So, or at least provide information. So, okay, in the interest of time, we should probably move on to the next question, if that's okay with everyone. So, I also want to get to the questions about that have been raised by individuals from Europe. So we will definitely get to your question in a minute. But before we do, there's one question that they come up, which is the findings of the task force may significantly impact the ways in which biological anthropologists conduct their research. Will the task force be considering the impacts of potential recommendations that may emerge from this work on how investigators are evaluated, how they publish, or their ability to acquire funding? I can say this is definitely, yeah, both Fatima and I are nodding because we remember all of these conversations and they are ongoing. So we have been talking expressly about that. In fact, one of the questions that is outstanding that we raise at the end of our preliminary report, we have a handful of questions that have emerged out of our initial findings. And one of the questions we have is, should we be setting guidelines, right? And I think that that will probably be something that the AABA will decide to do or not to do based on our advice. But if the AABA decides to create guidelines, one of the questions that we ultimately have is, you know, how do we ensure that the guidelines are useful for both the communities and for the scientists or the researchers? How do we ensure that the guidelines are flexible enough to be able to work with multiple communities? That's going to be an issue. And also flexible enough to understand the different contexts that researchers are working under. So that's going to be one of the pieces that we definitely have to take into consideration. And enforcement, a word that I shy away from using, but nonetheless, it came up. It has come up, and especially in talking to the African American community in our focus groups, enforcement came up a lot. So Fatima, as you said, you know, no one wants to call the police, but if we create guidelines, there has to be some form of enforcement, and we don't know. We're not here to set policy, but we are definitely having conversations about that piece. Because we do know that any decisions that ultimately get made are going to have serious implications for people's ability to do research, for how people publish, for how people get funding, et cetera. So this is something that we want to hear input about. So if you have thoughts or concerns, please email us and let us know what your concerns particularly are so we can introduce those into the task force for further deliberation. But yes, that is definitely something that we are talking about within the task force. Okay, so to address, there were a couple of comments. There were a couple comments about discussing how this work would work, how what we're talking about with community partnered research would work outside the United States. I definitely know that there are many individuals who are heavily involved with partnered research outside the United States. They are involved with the communities. It is baked in to research in certain regions of the world, especially in parts of Europe. And so we don't want this to come off as ethics. I think the the statement was, the laws in Europe are totally different, and we know that. We know about the law. I mean, like, I don't know every different country's laws, but I definitely know, like, French laws on patrimony are very different. In fact, this has been a conversation we've had within the task force about the fact that there are very different laws in other countries that make some of what we're recommending not universal. And so we want to hear, though, from those of you who are working in places where you don't see the approach that we are talking about here being applicable or being something that you could implement if you wanted to. We need to hear about that so that way we can incorporate that into what we're talking about and how we move forward as a task force. So that's to basically say that if you're working in other countries, or if you're working in other contexts that make community partnered research more difficult, if the laws that are present would maybe, or just the ethical practices that you have are very different, we want to know about that because, to quote Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which is not always the best person to quote, but data, I can't make bricks without clay. That's a Sherlock Holmes quote. But anyway, basically, we need data. So we can't address things that we don't know. So please let us know about those particular pieces of information so we can incorporate those. Okay. Thank you all for your patience. I just wanted to address those two questions before we got away from ourselves. So the next question for everyone is, someone has said that they are working with remains of dubious origin. They're not comfortable using photos of the remains. So do you recommend using photos, or would it be better not to use any photos of the remains since they will likely be retired and hopefully reburied soon?
So clearly the decision to use photos or not really depends upon the culture that you're dealing with. I mean, we keep going back to the community, but the community, they set the standards. We are the technicians. We have technical knowledge. The community has cultural knowledge. We blend the two, and when we do it successfully, we develop unique insights that someone who's not tuned into the culture and who doesn't have the technical skills we have would not be able to develop. So, we really have to work hand in hand consistently with the descendant community, however the descendant community is defined. We have to listen to them, and we have to recognize that they may agree to at point A, but at point B disagree, So yes, it's tenuous for we as researchers because we like to feel that we're in control, but we're not in control. It's a partnership. And if it's not a partnership, then we've failed.
All right. If I could just piggyback very quickly, only because we're actually working through this very issue now, and traditionally has not been a problem. At least the projects that I've worked on. But as Dr. Jackson says, it's the community's choice. And so, for example, with the Will project, and I can't go into too much detail here, but given the circumstances under which these individuals were found, in a will, having been discarded and used, possibly quite likely grave robbed for the purpose of medical surgical training, poor and enslaved individuals primarily. Given those circumstances, there are some reservations about the possible further exploitation of them graphically through use of illustrations. And so one of the possibilities we're considering then is to use other renderings, illustrations and other forms. Now, will this always be an issue? We don't know. We're going to work through a work group and sit down with community members and kind of say, okay, this is why someone would want to show an image. The taphonomy, is important, to kind of show that, oh, wow, this is a remain that looked, fairly intact. We thought we get good preservation, but did not. And here are some that, vice versa. And so the imagery can be important, but ultimately we do, we yield to the community's decisions and their sensibilities and sensitivities around this. And and we, as Dr. Jackson said, kind of, we imagine it will be a moving target, and at, some points in the process, they may be fine with it, and others are not, for different reasons. And so it's just dynamic, it's always in play. And I think we've got to get used to this new landscape in which, as Dr. Jackson said, once again, of partnering and truly partnering, meaning that, there will be some compromise likely on both sides.
Mhm. Yes.
Does anyone have any other thoughts? This is a question that may be beyond the scope of what we can address, but I'm going to ask, do you think there should be more laws surrounding the sale of human remains to private owners and the sale of human remains online? If so, what kind of legislation should be made?
I'm so uncomfortable with the idea of the sale of human remains, and most paleoanthropologists don't even like the sale of artifacts, the commercial sale of artifacts, or the sale of mammoth bones. So, and I similarly am uncomfortable with the idea of saying, I think there's something that we need to understand with respect to African Americans. The possession of African American skeletal material is often within a criminal context. That is, a crime has been committed, and that's why you have my cousin's bones. Now, once we understand that as scientists, then we can understand the hesitancy that many in the community have had about our possession of their relatives. So again, let's put this in the proper framework. A crime was committed, and it reminds me of Emmett Till's mother, who said, I'm going to keep the casket open so everyone can see what they did to my son. So again, be aware of the sensitivities of the community that you're working with and their history. And then, rather than transposing some other group's ideas about photographs or some other group's ideas onto your target community.
Other thoughts? I mean, I agree completely, Fatima, but okay. So this is actually a question for you all as panelists, and I see we have about 20 minutes left, so we can go a little bit after the hour, but I also value everyone's time here, so I don't want to presume, but this is a question. Basically, the question is, will recording of the webinar be available? The answer to that question is yes, but the question is to whom? So, for example, would it be shared with institutional representatives? For example, the VP for research at universities who can be educated, co-educated to help resolve long-standing, deeply troubled problems at universities that house human remains. So I would say that this is a discussion. And so from my point of view, if it helps people understand at least the ongoing conversation we're having within the association about these issues, then if that's helpful, then, it'll be publicly available in the sense that we're putting it on the AABA website after this. So I believe, so in that sense, anyone who goes on that website will be able to see it. But you all as panelists, do you have any other insights about using our collective wisdom to arbitrate issues within institutions?
That's above my pay grade.
Right. If it's helpful, please use it.
But we're going to try to do no harm. I'll put it that way. So, okay. I hope that answers your question. I hope that answers your question. So this has actually been something that was brought up actually in the surveys, but it's being brought up again here. This person asks that they have been a small, they're at a small institutional, they have a small institutional skeletal collection, which in the past has been used for teaching. The provenience of the skeletal material is largely undocumented, but probably purchased from a biological supply company. Is community engagement possible in that context? And to piggyback on that question, there's another question that was just asked afterward, which is that much of the discussion has been talking about forward-looking and future research, but the initial discussion was sparked about teaching, and that was because of the use of the victims of the MOVE bombing in a teaching environment. So what about best practices for simple stewardship, handling, display, and other non-research related treatment of human remains would we have to provide? So how do we deal with the teaching side of using human remains? So part of it is, how do we engage in communities when we can't necessarily, this goes back to how do you identify, especially when you acquire through a biological supply company? And then how should we be dealing with stewardship of remains when they're being used in these teaching collections, especially when they're poorly provenienced? I'll just editorialize real quickly. So when Dr. Jackson and I first met, I was instructing at University of Maryland, the osteology course there, and at Maryland, they had skeletal remains, and I didn't know where they belong, and that's not to out University of Maryland. I'm just saying that that was necessarily the case at the time, that, you know, we didn't know where those skeletal remains came from. And in fact, I remember having conversations about this in 2004 about like where are these remains from. So this has been something that has been on the mind of the task force. But I'm going to turn the question over to the panelists. So how do you think we might address these concerns about using teaching remains of unknown provenience? Do we try to do community engagement if it's possible? And then how do we be stewards of those remains? Does anyone have a question, an idea?
Okay, so so I could perhaps start us off. I know that I teach osteology for our department, and we do not use. We do use for now still some of the teaching remains that have been procured through the supply, biological supply company, likely of subcontinental, Indian origin. We do not use skeletal remains, of any others that have been, excavated or otherwise procured of unknown provenience. We simply don't use those. I do know that even this broader, question, I guess, is being taken up, by the AAA panel as well. It's kind of looking at a broader range. I think we're focused here on kind of research primarily. I take it, but if it's, but yeah, my response to that is that, here, even given the constructed nature of the community and social dissent that I kind of spoke of, it sounds like that would even be prove challenging to, try to engage in meaningful, community engagement around these remains. It's difficult to say without knowing a little bit more, about what you mean by, I'm sorry, I lost the phrasing, but the institutional skeletal collection. I believe sounds as though that would prove, quite challenging, but perhaps not if perhaps if you know more or have some idea as to where those remains may have come. I would say yes. I would say that there is a responsibility to try to reach out and figure out as best you can the provenience and what the proper disposition would be. Otherwise, but in terms of the teaching, we do not use those remains of unknown provenience. There are some that we're using and for which we have explicit permission to use from the communities for which this work was done. But no, we're not comfortable in using those with unknown provenience. Some of which, even I imagine even the way in which they procured may be unknown.
I would probably second that as well. And this is not also a view that I have also historically, even in my sort of short career, always followed as well. And when I was, would teach osteology courses and things like that, I was not following the advice that I am probably about to give, which echoes what Joe is saying is, unless you have the explicit permission, from those individuals, then the choice would be not to use them for teaching purposes. There are, luckily there are lots of universities and institutions around the country now that have, documented, consented collections that are an amazing resource. And, through various casting companies, you can get, replicas of those. I would also add that even if you are not using you're not using real human remains, and you are using a replica of human remains, those replicas may also be copies that were not given consent. So just because you're not using an actual human bone, the copy of that human bone may not have been given, explicit permission to be cast as well. So just some things to consider.
I do think this is something that we as an association, certainly we as a task force, will need to consider further as well, right? Because there's the kind of ideal form of what we would like to see happen, but there's also the realistic kind of like, people need to teach osteology. So what do you use to teach osteology? If you're in these kind of, gray kind of muddy spaces where from our point of view, you should have consent. But at the same time, if you don't have consent, but you don't have anything else to teach with, how do you teach? So this is something, and then how do we get resources to those who need those resources to be able to teach, right? When they don't have access. So this is something that I think it's certainly above our pay grade as a task force, but it's certainly something that we can enter into the conversation thinking about, because I think it is an important additional piece. Yeah, we have been focused largely on the questions of research, but teaching is very much a partner to all of that. So I think that is something that we do need to take into consideration. So thank you all for your insights.
Just to add, I feel like at every question I may be like here playing devil's advocate, right? The reason for using human remains as teaching materials was the very underlying reason for grave robbing, for establishing these medical schools. And so if we're moving forward in 2022, almost 2023, with the same reasoning that we have the materials, regardless of how they were acquired, but we need them to teach, doesn't show much progress. I mean, even if teaching digitally during COVID has taught us anything, right? You have to figure out how to teach an anatomy class virtually and online and without using human remains or exploiting, someone's ancestor. So again, I don't have all of the answers, but I think that I'm playing my role here on the task force, right? That there are these points that we also need to consider and think about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So we have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to ask maybe a couple more questions if you all, this is a marathon session. I imagine everyone's a little tired. So hopefully we can address a couple more questions, and then we will sum up. There has been a question about what we think the long-term care should be for individuals that may never be repatriated or studied. So if there's an individual of known ancestry, but the community has declined repatriation, and there's not necessarily any sort of desire to do research, what is our responsibility for those remains?
Ben, this sounds like a question we need to put to the community. You know,
Okay.
in our surveys, it's one of the things perhaps we should ask. What if they don't want repatriation? What do they expect of the scientists?
Right.
Mhm.
I am noting that one. It will be one that we return to communities with, I think, to ask.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
And so the last question I have earmarked here, I just will bring up because I think that this is one that there's certainly anxiety for people who are in graduate studies. So everything that we talk about in terms of community engaged research takes time, right? I think one of the pieces is that, building community partnered research takes time, it takes patience, it takes trust, it takes communication. And the concern that comes up here is if we are adding community engagement on this level, it will make student research take longer, not shorter. And that's one of the points that's been brought up here. So will the AABA do anything to pressure universities to make sure they know our research takes a lot of time and will take even more time to ensure that graduate students who are not part of larger projects have time to complete their degrees? I don't have an answer myself. I think that this is something that is on our minds. I think this is definitely a concern because it did come across in the AABA survey. One of the things that we looked at, it's in the report, in the preliminary report, is that we found that there are a number of individuals who are already engaged in community partnered research. And some of those individuals are graduate students. So we could, cross-reference that someone self-identified as a graduate student and that they're doing community partnered research. But the question that we didn't think to ask on that survey was, well, is it your community partnered research that you forged yourself, or is it community partner research that you're forging through your mentor, where they've already made the connections and developed that trust? And I think that this is something we don't know. Like, we don't know the mechanisms by which individuals have actually been able to engage in community partnered research. So since you all have been engaged in community partnered research, what do you all think of addressing this problem of when you're especially a junior researcher? It's not necessarily just a graduate student, but someone who's starting off their career and they need time to be able to build these connections with communities to be able to do community partnered research. How do you think that that should be built into the framework? Because we are in a larger academic world that may not recognize the fact that there are time constraints that they impose that we may not necessarily be able to realize.
I want to jump in. So before we even answer that question, and I think this even goes back to the previous question about who's employing community partnered research and like what that means, right? And you can find someone locally or at your university who's doing community partner research, but it's kind of like the saying, all money isn't good money, right? So all community partnered research isn't good community partnered research, or is it community partnered research to whose benefit? Because if you think about it, helicopter research, right, or performative research is also community partnered under possibly false pretenses or the myriad of reasons that it could be, described. And then I think that is why this task force is so important, to lay those guidelines, because when things have been done the same way for so long, you believe that they are done the right way, strictly out of tradition. And so I think, again, those are additional questions and points that we need to address. Like, what type of community partnered research, are we thinking about moving forward?
Joseph, did you have something to add? Or Jennifer?
Yes, sorry, trying to dig up the question there again, but I've got the correct
Oh,
one
I
here.
think it may have been retired. Let me reopen it. There it is.
Yeah, the graduate programs, yeah.
Oh, yes, yes, and the impact of, this engagement, impact of engagement on the process. So this is, yeah, this is really not an easy question to answer there. Certainly there are impacts for students, and we have to kind of weigh, I think we have to consider and to weigh those impacts seriously with our commitment to community empowerment. I'm kind of speaking again in a way that I can't give much detail, but again, we're wrestling with this also with one of our projects. And on the one hand, we're kind of having the need for students to move efficiently through their programs is kind of on one side of the scale, and the need for community members to feel as though they are involved in every phase of this project. So we've got a community group that is really interested in taking their stewardship responsibilities seriously, and so they want to hear about things that we just simply didn't think that they would necessarily want to hear about. Their interest there, and so on the one hand we welcome that, but it does alter the trajectory, the time trajectory for the students. And as you say, Ben, also for us, as junior scholars as well, there are choices that, I think we have to make. We're not yet at the point, at the university or kind of academy level, yet where community engagement is, fully, I think, respected and rewarded for the significance that it brings, to the institution, and ultimately to, even to our discipline, to the work that we do in terms of our ability to produce and to create knowledge more effectively. That said, I do think that descendant community engagement is here to stay. Just a few weeks ago, I spoke to the Park Service, their superintendents and assistant superintendents workshop, and they were there fully engaged, taking notes, trying to figure out, how they're going to be incorporating, these models, into the work that they're doing. So I think that, that will change, but in the short term, in the interim, I think that, those are, there's some decisions and calculations, that I think we, even as individual researchers, will have to make in terms of our time commitments. I've been very, kind of committed to community engagement, and I've been fortunate, in some regards to be able to do this work. But also, I'm very aware also that, that there are, choices, and there are, consequences to the coin of the realm is still, publishing, and this does slow down that process, even to the extent that we include vetting processes for publications with our community members. They have say as to, kind of the nature and some of the publications that get that are underway. So there is no one size fits all answer for that question. I think that at this stage, at least, I think the individual researcher has to think about, weigh their own options there, and to consider what the various consequences might be. But know that this work is the future, is forefront, and it is very rewarding as well.
So I think that one of the primary questions is, should community engagement and recruitment, should it be centralized at your institution, or should it be on the responsibility of the lab? Mm-hmm. And I personally don't think it should be centralized fully. And I say that because when I'm out in the field, I enjoy engaging with people. I know a lot of times, especially as a basic scientist, people don't like primary collection. I try to write it in all the time, even if it doesn't save me time. It creates another important layer to research, especially in the field of public health and anthropology, and also in genetics. I think population geneticists are kind of rare in that we get to really dive into communities. And so you kind of have to ask yourself that question as a graduate student. And I'm sure Carter and I both were brought with this question of how focused do you want to be on community engagement, and at what level? And with Dr. Jackson being our advisor, it was never up to her for her to establish contacts for me. It was for her to give me a lane and give me an in, and for me to create a roadmap as a graduate student of who I needed to talk to and where, how could they fit into the project. So it's really important to me to be a part of your educational process. I wish that people found joy in it the way that I do, because I think that it would create a more of a reciprocal relationship, right? So a lot of times community partners don't want to talk to the recruitment officer. They want to talk to the person that's going to be handling their samples and making decisions about the research. And I think that's something we should keep in mind, is that when you, as a PI, totally step away from the process of recruitment or talking to your community advisory board, it creates a lack of relationship there. And people don't always move as fast as you need them to move if you're so removed from the work, right? So I think that you should consider those items when you're designing your studies.
No, I think that you just touched on something that since we're at the hour or so we probably need to start wrapping up. But Jennifer, you just touched on something I think that we haven't said, which is that there's a richness that comes from community engaged research. I think it's been implied, but there is a richness that comes out of it that you don't get if you're not, engaging with those communities. So it's not just, I think that there's a consideration of carrots that we haven't been talking about. We've been talking about, there's been questions about the sticks, right? So there've been questions about, well, what are punitive measures? There are these very realistic concerns that everyone's bringing up that we need to consider as a task force. But I would also say that, there are a lot of benefits that might come out of this shift that we're talking about, maybe, informing the AABA leadership of that, ultimately, if what the task force finds is that, community partnered research, which is, again, that's born out of our surveys. The surveys both point us toward community partnered research. So that's why we're chasing this particular theme down, right? It could have very well been that, when we talked to members of the African-American community, they came back and said, we don't want to have anything to do whatsoever with the scientific community. Or we could have heard from the AABA membership, and you all collectively could have told us, we absolutely don't want to do anything that's community partner based. But both groups in our early surveys said, yes, community partnered research is something ideally we'd like to do. So we're pursuing that as a task force to try to give some guidelines and guidance on how that works. And so, as you all pointed out, it does add time, but it's time well spent.
Yes. The quality of the research is much better. And I don't know how many reports that I've read on African-American health that were so poorly done. The statistics were fine, but the insight into the population was really poor. It could have been done by someone from Mars. They didn't have any information on the priorities of the people. I didn't hear the voice of the subjects at all. And so if we want better quality biological anthropology, we have to engage more intimately with our target populations and integrate their priorities into our work, because we have the skills. I did some work with the Mayans years ago in Yucatan, and I thought that they would be interested in knowing, I thought they would be interested in knowing their diabetes risk. They weren't interested in that at all. They said, we want to know why we're so short. And I thought, how politically insensitive. I would have never said that to them, but they said it. And they said that, tell us why we're so short and why we're at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. So we have to listen to the communities that we are engaged with and respect them as collaborators, not subjects, but as collaborators. And that addresses many of the questions that we've been posed, that have been posed today.
And speaking of collaborators, so I respect all of you as my collaborators, including everyone that we can't see who has been joining us. And so we thank you all for the time.
Yeah.
We think, so I want to especially very much thank Drs. Clinton, Jones, Caldwell, and Mosley, and most of all for you, Dr. Jackson. I want to thank everyone. You all have been giving some excellent insight. The task force's work is not complete. So I want to make sure everyone knows that we are still working. We probably have somewhere around 10 more months. We're not going to give a final date because we're trying to do the work in a meaningful way, but we don't want to just say, we're done on this date and then not make that deadline. So we are working very hard to try to wrap this up in 2023 as a task force. We want to hear from members of the AABA. We've heard from you in the survey, but if you had questions, or if you're watching this as a recording and you've got questions you want to ask, please email us, and feel free to email Dr. Jackson and myself. So my email is auerbach@utk.edu, and Dr. Jackson's is fatima.jackson@howard.edu. So you can reach both of us, and we will pass the questions on to the other panelists, but also feel free to email anyone on the task force. The report, the preliminary report, is with the AABA leadership. I believe that Dr. Stephen Lee, the president of the association, is going to be posting that report on the website shortly. And it will be also announced in the December newsletter, he's told me. So you will be getting a chance to read through that. We tried to make it pithy so that way it doesn't go on as I tend to go on. So with that said, does anyone have any last thoughts that you wanted to pass on before we concluded today's webinar?
I would just thank you both again, Drs. Auerbach and Jackson. Thank all of the members of the association who joined us today, and just again, just to reiterate, that this community engagement, descendant community engagement, it is not going anywhere. It's the future, for our subfield, for our field, and for many disciplines. And so I would just say it would behoove us to continue to to work through these issues, to address them head on, and we'll be all the better for it. Thank you all again.
Thank you. I should also mention very briefly a massive thanks to the members of the task force who aren't here with us right now. They have been instrumental to getting us to where we are at this point, and we cannot thank all of you all enough for the work that you all have been doing as well as part of the task force. So thank. I mean, should I just go ahead and name everyone on the task force very quickly, just so people have? So the other members of the task force not present are Dr. Shamsi Berry, Ellen Lafaro, Ripon Mulhey, Charlotte Roberts, Michael Blakey, Ellen Goodman, Joseph Graves, and Lance Gravely. We are actually adding additional people right now to the task force, and we'll be announcing those additional couple of people shortly once we've got everything agreed upon with the leadership. So, but I just want to thank everyone, because it has been a tremendous amount of lifting, and we couldn't do it without everyone together. So that said, our work is still ongoing. So if anyone has continuing questions for us, ideas, concerns, please email us. The more we hear, the more information we have, the more we can address blind spots that we have as a task force. All right. Thank you all very much. Enjoy your afternoons and your weekends.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, panel. Good job.